All right. Glad to be with you. I've shared this topic here. I've been coming to this conference since it started and do this lecture or one like it about every 2 or 3 years. And I do it for one reason. For me, apologetics is valuable. Well, I'll give you what I think are the two top reasons. Number one, over the years, a number of people have come to Christ through the use of apologetics. And I won't give you all examples, but if you think about it, you can think about New Testament cases where people have experienced Christ, doubting Thomas, so to speak. John was a doubter. John the Baptist, he wasn't an unbeliever, but when his disciples came to Jesus, he didn't respond. Jesus didn't respond to the two disciples by telling John, hey, go jump in a lake. I don't give evidences to anybody. You say, well, wait a minute. He said in Matthew, I won't give any evidence except for the resurrection. Why did he tell John? He gives a list of miracles to John. Why? I think it's because the Pharisees, for example, were not going to believe no matter what. And we'll tell you why that is in a minute. It's for emotional and worldview questions, and it's all on here. But why did he give them to John? Because for some people, John was a believer, and John the Baptist, and Jesus instructed his disciples to share with him the miracles that Jesus did. And while they were leaving, the two disciples, Jesus didn't chew them out. He didn't say, oh, you all shouldn't be asking for signs. That's when he said that John was the most righteous, the greatest man ever born of a woman. While they were still leaving, that means John was still doubting. John was still on his deathbed because he was in prison and he wasn't going to get out alive. And they took back assurance that evidences could provide. But the Pharisees, we know a lot of people like this today. It's been growing a lot more in percentage than in Jesus' day. But folks today reject the gospel, not because they can refute it, but because either emotions and or worldview questions get in the way. Now, I'm going to say a few things here about two kinds of doubt in particular. I define doubt very simply as uncertainty regarding God or our relationship to him. I would say that uncertainty is probably the best synonym for what doubt is. But I'm going to talk about two kinds of the kinds of questions and families we can talk about here. Factual or philosophical doubt. This is common enough. It seems to be what the Apostle Thomas asked Jesus. I won't believe unless I can see. We have emotional doubt. And I won't be able to talk about volitional doubt today, but I'll just be able to give a hint. I only want to say a few things about factual doubt and then speak the rest of the time about emotional doubt. Why? Because according to studies, and we have a guy down here in the front row, Ron Davis, he and Ben have core ministry in the book room, but Ron's got a PhD in this area in doubt. Ben works on the other side with discipleship and the evidence of stuff. And Ron, how many people have you probably, he's not a guy who goes around giving numbers, but you've talked with how many separate people, doubters? Pardon? A little over 1,600 people. How many separate meetings with those 1,600 people? Thousands. So, and what percentage did you say in your dissertation? I was there for your exposition of it. What percentage of those people do you think are emotional doubters? A little over 70%. He surveyed them. You have three categories, and one category is about 2/3 plus of doubt. But I'm going to tell you what, I'm going to make this part of the story real short. But I went through doubt myself for about on and off for 10 to 20 years, 10 serious and 10 more on and off. And I wished that somebody would have told me what I'm going to share with you today. Because in those days, the only people who wrote about doubt were pastors, and they were good. They were good. But we have specialists today in almost every area of apologetics. And I wish somebody had told me, you've been studying the resurrection for years, and have you solved your doubt? No. What do you think's wrong? I don't know. It's not clicking. What if I'm not elect? What if I didn't say the right words? What if I said the right words, but the next day I nullified it by some kind of sin? What if I'm tricking myself and I don't really want to be there, but I think I do, and now I'm all mixed up? Emotional, let me deal with each. Factual doubt, there's a real easy answer. What's factual doubt? Here's another question that's much more complicated. What is emotional doubt? These are the kind of questions that we ask in each of those categories. Factual doubt is treated by the facts for history or data for philosophy, and often they dovetail. Factual doubt ideally would be, this problem has really been killing me. Joshua and wiping out the people in the country that God had sent him. What are we supposed to say about that? Factual doubt is giving data and different ways to handle it. Today we have people like Michael Heiser, who's got one explanation. Paul Copan takes another approach. We have a lot of options to answer most of our questions. And the answer to factual doubt is the facts. Let me say one word about that. I should have brought it. It's a totally different slide presentation. But I like to do what I call a circle chart. And this chart has the bullseye is gospel data. Gospel data. And I think at the very least, gospel data would include the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. At least those. You say, what about the burial? Well, that's not mentioned in very many of the passages that define the gospel. The passages are mostly in Paul and in the book of Acts. Okay, should something else be in there? Well, there's other important doctrines, and that's a larger circle, which are still fundamentals, but they're never told you have to believe in this blank to be a Christian. And Christianity is a faith that majors in the major questions. And, well, I'll tell you what. Mike Licona, some of you know that name, he's a prominent New Testament professor, was a student of mine at Liberty and a friend of all of ours. And he's got a famous story he tells, which really happened at the beginning of his latest book. And he calls it the Baltimore Call. He went to Baltimore after finishing his master's work at Liberty. He went elsewhere and did his PhD. And he called me one night. And between us, we call it the Baltimore Call. And he was having a lot of doubts. And to hear him talk, he said, I felt like I was an inch from deconstructing. Now, it's a big thing today. And this is a family conference. Deconstructing is very, very common. And how do we actually treat it? Deconstructing, I think, for the most part, is emotional doubt. It's a species of emotional doubt, a type of emotional doubt. And here's how our conversation went. He represents the conversation. It's only a little over a page. And it goes like this. He said, Doc, I've got to ask you a question. I've got these questions because I've been told that there are errors in the New Testament or some things I can't figure out. And he went on for a little while, and he was getting kind of worked up. And I said, Mike, time out. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Mike said, well, yeah, of course. And we'd spent hours talking about it. Yeah, of course. But I've got this question. Mike, just one thing at a time. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Yes. Okay. Mike, do you know Jesus rose from the dead? Yes, I do. Why? He said, well, I use your minimal facts method. I take the facts the critics allow, and they're enough of a basis, even from atheist New Testament scholars. Now, interpretations are different than facts, but it's an easier interpretation to move from the facts that are granted to the view that Jesus is raised. He goes, I get that. Can I ask you a question? Sure. Well, there's this passage in Scripture, Mike. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Yeah, it's a given. He rose from the dead. But there's this one issue that's really bothering me. Mike, did Jesus rise from the dead? Yeah. Mike, if Jesus rose from the dead, what follows? Jesus is the Son of God. Well, Mike, did he teach that? Yeah. What was his best, besides that teaching, what's his best known teaching? The kingdom of God is here. The kingdom of God is real. And in a popular song from the 80s, Jesus holds the keys. He holds the keys to the kingdom. For Jesus to teach that he's the only way to salvation, what two things could a prophet teach that will get you the label false prophet more than God's kingdom is here now, it's really going to come in the future, and what you do with me determines where you spend eternity? That's the first one. I put two fingers up, but that's the first one. The kingdom and Jesus is the path. Second, by the way, I'm the Son of God. Now, I'm going to punt to my plenary lesson at the end of the day tomorrow, Lord willing, but there's some special and new arguments for the deity of Christ, which are really heavy. But for now, let's just say, and most scholars buy them, even critics, but for the most part, I'm just going to say, Jesus claimed two heretical things if they're heretical, if they're not true. He holds the keys to the kingdom, and he's the Son of God. How much more would you have to do to be a blasphemer before the God of the universe if one or both of those weren't true? But God raised him from the dead. Wow. Oh, that's significant. Oh, yeah, but that happened to Krishna and Buddha and you name anybody you want to. That happened to all the prophets, right? No. Why did God only read Jesus? Because he's a false prophet? Okay, Mike, that should do it, right? Yeah, Christianity is true. Hey, I got this question, though. What about this discrepancy? Mike, you're not listening. And now Mike and I, many years later, we have and I'll probably start with this tomorrow, Lord willing. You know where I teach at Liberty, so you know what I believe about Scripture. And I'm still going to say this, make this comment. In fact, I made it to a well-known prof around here today, and I mean, we know what this means. If Christ was raised from the dead, what's true? Christianity. Yeah, but what if there's these two? If Christ was raised from the dead, Christianity is true. Listen, if there's 100 errors in the New Testament, there aren't, but if there's 100 errors in the New Testament, if Jesus, Son of God, who died on the cross for sins and raised from the dead, Christianity is true. Now, can you move on from that? Yeah. So the conversation was almost over, and Mike said, wow, I feel so much better. That's true, because I do believe the resurrection. So Christianity is true. I'll work on all these other little issues, but if it's true, it's true. And he said, hey, one more question. What do you say about Joshua? And, that could be the toughest problem in the Bible, and the tribes that live there. And I said, Mike, did Jesus rise from the dead? He goes, I get it. And that was the end of the Baltimore call. That's factual doubt. Major on the major. We have a tendency to get off on the peripheries. And when you do, you're begging for the second kind of doubt, emotional. Stay on topic and ask yourself, do I have data, Jesus, the Son of God? Just listen tomorrow. Did Jesus die? Nobody disputes that. Did he rise from the dead? The evidence is overwhelming. Then what's true? Christianity does. What about my questions? Christianity's true. Yeah, but I got this issue. Christianity's true. But what am I supposed to say when Christianity's true? That's what you're supposed to say. So factual doubt majors on the major, and this is something that is answered by the data. Okay, just a couple of really quick things here. Identify the kind of doubt. If it's factual doubt, apply the data and move on. Volitional doubt, I told you I was only going to mention it. Volitional doubt usually works like this. Doubt starts as factual. If it's not answered, it morphs fairly quickly into emotional doubt. Oh no, I don't know what I'm going to do. And if I do this, and if you have anxiety tendencies or those kind of tendencies in your life, you will morph there more quickly. That's just the normal human path to go. And if you let yourself do it, you can trick yourself to think you're really thinking about factual questions that you left the corral a long time ago. You're out in the pasture and you're worried about other questions. So we have to talk mostly about emotional doubt because by far the most common, think about this, by far the most common, by far the most painful, and most likely the least serious. So you have to start telling yourself truthful things. It's more dangerous to worry about whether Jesus was raised from the dead. But emotional doubt is very, very common. It can hurt very, very badly, and it almost never serious in spiritual terms. But if emotional doubt goes on for a real long time, some people get mad at God. It's another kind of emotional doubt, and I won't be able to talk about that, but I'll just tell you, I usually deal with volitional doubt by talking about heaven. What does it mean? What's up for grabs? And try to develop a lifestyle that says heaven is something that should comment on how we live today. I'll just give you one example. Read 2 Corinthians 4, 16 to 18. Paul says the future, eternity, should determine our present, okay? Here's what I really want to talk about for the rest of the time. I want to look at two passages here. First off, Philippians 4, 6 through 9. Paul's not talking about doubt, but he is talking about anxiety. And it's the most common subspecies of emotional doubt. You go, why are you talking about psychology? It's not your field. Well, it really isn't. But the only time I went back to school after my PhD was to get a diploma in rational and motor behavior therapy. That does not make me a counselor. That does not make me a psychologist. But I taught this field for 10 years for PhD clinical counseling students to teach them about how philosophy and apologetics orients their thinking and feeling. And what you're going to get is something like this. Paul says, be anxious for nothing. The Greek there indicates that they were already in an anxious state of mind. They were living anxiously. Oh, can Christians do that? Well, John the Baptist did it. Paul talks about it regularly. Paul talks about going through anxiety. And he usually diagnoses it and tells us to supply the truth to the lies we're thinking. Philippians 4 is probably the best passage that does it well. Paul says, pray. Now, Paul doesn't say, pray like this. But if you go over to 1 Peter 5:7, it says, I hope that's clear. It looks pretty faint. But 1 Peter 5:7, Peter says, casting all your cares on him because he cares for you. That word for cares in 1 Peter is the word for anxiety. Casting all your anxieties on Christ. Now, if you're good at that, if you're good at praying such that you give your situation to the Lord and let him take care of it, well, then that's great. But that wasn't my strong suit when I went through it. Praying wasn't my strong suit. So Paul says, I singled it out. Paul says, he says, practice thanksgiving and praise. He does that twice in these verses. Now, I've done this in a lot of churches with a lot of people, and I'll say, we haven't rehearsed it. And I'll say to the people, how many of you have been going through a worked up state and either accidentally or on purpose, now here's what I mean by that, accidentally or on purpose, it was time to worship. Here's accidentally, oh, it's almost time to leave for church. And you all rush in the car and you get there, and the song leader says, let's sing a few songs of praise tonight, and whether you feel like it or not, you're praising. That's accidental. On purpose is when you say, I'm going to stop what I'm doing, and I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to, any of the following. I'm going to make a list, or in your mind, things where I've been blessed in the last week by the Lord. You go, I don't know if I'd have very many in that list. Okay, fine. Do a month. Ask how many prayer requests have you had answered in the last year. You know, if you're really sharp about this, when you have answers to prayer, write them down. Those from my generation, put them on a 3x5 card. It's like, what's that? And put them in a file so that when you're tempted to think, God may answer your prayers, but he doesn't answer mine. Go to your file, pull it out, chapter and verse, day and date, and he answered this. And you know the kind of prayer requests I used to enjoy? The kind where the specific thing, a very specific problem was determined by time that something needed to be done now. It's not going to be good for this prayer to be answered next week. Whatever it is, this has to be answered now. And I would keep track. In fact, we were involved in a large Sunday school class, a couple hundred people. And we had a big period of answers, prayers and answers. And so being of skeptical mind, for 2 years, I kept a prayer log. Prayer request, answered yes, no. But I had a sidebar. You ready? A sidebar. Impossible prayer requests. Here's an impossible prayer request. I know this isn't going to be answered, but I'll pray. I'm told to pray. I'll pray. Without faith, without anything, I'll pray. I'll try it. Don't think it's good. I'll try. After 2 years, I counted the prayers that have been answered that we shared in that class. 70% of the prayers have been answered in whole or in part in 2 years. But the sidebar, impossible prayer requests, I knew it. It dropped considerably from 70. It dropped all the way down to 60. Impossible. You're not supposed to have anything in this list, humanly speaking. It dropped to 60. So Paul says, pray and try giving thanks. So here what I'll ask in these groups, and I'll say, you go to church and accidentally or on purpose, you're praising. Now, I won't do this here. It'll take too long to do it. But I'd tell them in a big church on a Sunday morning, how many of it happened to you? Hands go up all over. All right, somebody yell it out, make it brief, few words. What happens when you praise and you're worked up? See, but that was hard for me because I was raised German Baptist. And when somebody would raise their hand, we'd all go like this. We'd sit up in the balcony, we'd go. Because in those days, people didn't raise their hands for everything. But, so you're praying, and you're praising, and things happen. So I'd say, what's going on? And somebody will say, I feel better right away. It doesn't take very long to start. I'll say, okay, tell me what happens. And here's the answer. People call things out from all over. We get 6 or 10 answers. Here's the one I got most of all. I started thinking about my perspective. When I was praising, I started thinking about my issues from God's perspective. You ever go to bed at night, like always, worrying about something, and you can't sleep for 15, 20 minutes or longer? You wake up the next morning, you think about the same thing. Where did I leave off last night? It doesn't even bother you the next morning. Have you had that happen before? Happens to me all the time. I think, why did I keep myself awake last night? This is silly. But Paul says, give praise. Thanksgiving and praise. But then he gives this beautiful, what I call goody two-shoes verse. This verse is never helpful until you need it. And brought my translation here. This is the Williams translation, which is a one-person translation, which makes it, one-person translations are a little more risky. But when you're a internationally known Greek scholar, people take it seriously. And here's what Paul says in verse 6. He says, stop being worried about anything with thanksgiving. Make your request known to God. And then look at verse 8. Now practice thinking on what is true, honorable, right, pure, lovable, what is high-toned, yes, on everything that is excellent or praiseworthy. He says, change your thinking. Change your thinking. From the anxious thoughts to the corrected thoughts. I'm going to tell you how to do it in just a minute, but Paul's going to do it. Paul tells you here, take those thoughts and don't let yourself get torn away by the what ifs. Here's how you know what anxious doubt is. Anxious doubt is told by two things in particular. What if questions. Yeah, but what if he really is sick? Is he? Well, not now, but people get sick. Yeah, I'm aware of that. But what if we can't pay the bills next month? What if we're worried about so-and-so because we don't know where they are in salvation? Well, you're not going to solve that tonight. No, not going to shouldn't keep you awake. What if? But here's the main thing for emotional doubt. It hurts. It's painful. Factual doubt doesn't hurt. You go, I don't know, I had some factual doubts a little bit painful, because probably it was morphing over a little bit to the emotional category, and that's painful. Volitional doubt doesn't hurt, because volitional doubt is usually, I work with the psychologists, we tested people on this, and volitional doubt, what loads on volitional doubt is anger, the psychological state, anger. What loads on emotional doubt is anxiety. Two of the most common illnesses in our society. If you're anxious, what if, and it's hurting. And let me tell you one more thing. Why are you anxious about your doubts? Why are you usually anxious about your doubts? Why not who's going to win the football game tomorrow? Well, I worry about that too, but not like my doubts. You know why? Doubt usually settles on the things in our life that are the most important to us. Who would worry about something that you don't care about? You worry about things that are the most concerning to you. Family needs, especially children. If you're grandparents, you know the old saying, I don't have to discipline them, I can just love them. Oh yeah, and worry a lot about them. Family members, salvation. What about mine? Whatever, however you ask it. But we in emotional doubt, you worry about things that are most important to you. They settle on your loved ones, your faith. You don't worry about things you don't care about. Getting the car fixed next week. Yeah, that's a real pain. But I don't sit there and stay up all night about it. All right, this is Paul. And Paul says in the next verse, I call it practice, practice, practice. He says, whatever you've seen in me, practice these things. The Greek means to keep practicing it over and over. How long? Until it works, until it settles in, until you telling yourself the truth overcomes the baloney you've been telling yourself. This is Paul, and it's a great passage, and there are many others. But when I went back to study this, and I told you I did that diploma, psychologists have a funny practice. They rate the most influential psychologists in the world. And they're all secular, it's a secular discipline. And the guy that was number one until he passed away about 15 years ago was Albert Ellis. The first time I ever heard him in person, he was at a debate with a Christian psychologist, and he said, I could say it the way he said it. He had a very gruff voice. He could, as the saying goes, he could outdo most sailors with his language. And I heard him say, up here, audience filled for the debate, and he said, I've got 5 volumes of material that prove that being a Christian will send you to the nut house. That's pretty close to a quote for what he said. 5 volumes. Later, he changed his view. This might interest you. He told me later, because I studied with him. He's the one I took this thing with. I studied with him, and he told me, he said, I realize now I'm allowing articles in our journals from Christians. I wouldn't have allowed that decades ago. He said, you know why I did? I realized the kind of Christianity I was going out after was what we call today legalism. Like, you might be going to hell, forgive me if I'm offending anybody, you may be going to hell if your hair touches your ears. I mean, we could make some really crazy rules in those days. And I was German Baptist, so the German didn't help the Baptist, but they both worked to tighten things down. And everything was wrong. And the feeling was, I might be going to hell if I did this. If I went to a movie. Yeah, I know, but it was Walt Disney. You know, they've got some pretty bad movies. And he said, I was trying to tell people that kind of thinking, legalistic thinking. Think about your circles. If the gospel's in the middle, where are the legalistic things? If they're there at all, they're way out in the perimeter. And we don't practice much of them today, I don't think. So here's what Ellis suggested. This is probably the most famous psychological tool. It's called the ABC method. I can tell you what the ABC stands for, but it's not going to make any difference. ABC will work. A's are activating events. They're things that happen to you. B's are your beliefs about what happened to you, and C's are the consequences. What happened to you? How did you react? And what's the bottom line? Now, we've got a close friend who was in a car accident many years and was rear-ended by like an 18-wheeler. This person was okay, except that they lived on very strong painkillers because there were things that were done to their back that they didn't even know how to repair decades ago. Now, since it's been repaired, but this person lived with her pain for probably 30 years on triple the strongest painkillers. In fact, they had to take her off them after a while because they're afraid that the painkillers were causing other things. Now, here's the problem. Let's take that case. You're telling me that A's don't cause C's? Activating events don't cause bad consequences? No, I didn't say things that happen to you won't cause bad consequences. But if you let A's run your life, you're in trouble. And that's what the B's are. The B's are, and here's the saying, one of the things Ellis said, he's a clinical psychologist, PhD, clinical psychology, a special brand that does a lot of diagnosing, like in the medical arm of things. And here's a famous statement of his. A's could be worse than B's sometimes, but usually most of your pain is not caused by what happens to you. It's caused by how you download it. It's what you say to yourself about your pain. If you say, I'll never be the same. Now, if your point is I'll never be able to play football again, I got to that point a long time ago. So I sleep in a chair instead of in a bed. My back doesn't work. Well, yeah, I was injured. Okay, so was I. I didn't die. Okay, what'd you say to yourself? Well, I said I won't be able to keep my job. What if? And what if I'm not saved? Because I'm not responding very well, I admit that. A's, here's Ellis, A's don't cause C's. Events don't make you say certain things to yourself. Now, B's are divided, and B's, there are good B's and bad B's. Always remember this line. Bad B's kill. Good B's bring life. Go for everybody? Yeah, for everybody. You could be a non-Christian. I believe these are psychological laws in the universe that God created. If you don't major on the A that happened and the bad B, never be able to work again, I'm going to have to live like this, my family will be angry with me, my wife or my husband already is, this, and it's never going to work out. And you worry. And you're on pain medicine, and that hurts. Bad beliefs, bad Bs are the number one opponent in life. A's can sometimes, being hit by an 18-wheeler can hurt and can mess you up. Bad Bs can mess you up a lot faster and more quickly. So how do you counteract it? With good Bs, good beliefs. And you say, I'll never be like this again. I'll never be able to do this. I'll never be. And now this might sound flippant to you, but it really works. Talk to somebody like Ron or Ben or guys who've dealt with a lot of doubters, and say this to them if they're believers. Let's say you're in the ministry and talk to a lot of believers. Try the one I use with volitional doubters, the third one. I'd say this. Do you believe in the resurrection? I do. Do you think it's got anything to say to this? No. Because I'm really hurting. I'm pain pills. Okay, hold on. Was Christ raised from the dead? He was. What difference does that make in your life? Well, I have eternal life. Excellent place to start. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, 16 to 18, to you, he just got done talking about heaven. Just back up 2-3 verses. And Paul says, why think about finite things when we think about heavenly things? And you know, Paul is always talking about how much he was beaten up for Christ. How many 18-wheeler incidents did he have? He was stoned and left for dead at Lystra. And that, by the way, may have been the old commentaries say this before the thing at present. That may be when he had the near-death experience, which he seems to be explaining in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He visited the third heaven and saw things that it was unlawful to explain because secrets of the universe kind of thing. But he went to the third heaven. Talks about being with Christ, Philippians chapter 1. He was there, and he said, I prefer to go back. Whoa, wait a minute. You were there? He seems to be saying that. He does say in Philippians 1, 21 and 23, to die is gain. And then in verse 23, he says, to go to be with Christ is better by far. Some commentaries and some translations translate that phrase like this. I prefer to die and be with Christ, Philippians 1:23, because it is better, comma, far better. Really? You bring heaven to bear on present problems? You know Paul just gets done talking about there? He talks about being persecuted, and he hopes the persecution continues because it's gaining rewards for him. What? You think like that? Maybe it shows you our thinking is bad. But this is very, very important. I teach a whole course on doubt, a PhD course. We can do this for a whole semester. But what I'm saying is, if you could think of the examples, we don't normally think we think like this. I think we think like this. Yeah, resurrection happened, check. Heaven exists, check. I don't know what that does to this doubt I'm talking about. Bad B. What should you be saying? Here's what you can say. Christ, the Son of God, died on the cross for my sins, rose from the dead. Heaven is secured. I'm on the path. How do you know? Because I said I do to Jesus, like the marriage commitment you make to your spouse if you're married. It's a commitment. Now, apply the truth of heaven to whatever you're going through and say, no matter what happens, we can live through it. Paul almost, a lot of you, I can see you shaking your head while I'm talking. I'm guessing you've gone through some of this and you learned how to do this. It's life-changing. And if you dictate, you go, yeah, you could hurt. But who goes around bragging about getting beat up? Paul. He says, I bear the Lord's scars in my body. I was left for dead at Lystra. And then he says in 2 Corinthians 4, another passage, Philippians 3, he says, concentrate on heaven and bring them to bear in the present. Bring them to bear in the present. You say, well, for unbelievers too? Maybe you counsel unbelievers. And you don't want to, you're a little shaky about saying, should I promise this to them? Is this like a promise for believers alone? I think the reason, let me tell you something about this method, this ABC thing of Ellis. He's the most influential psychotherapist. This method, this ABC method, is just universally known among counselors. But here's the key. Christian counselors use it, and non-Christian counselors use it. They don't give their patients the latter. They don't give their patients the plan of salvation. They tell them about changing their bad B's, and they feel much better, and they're more thankful, and they pay their bills. But they can still change their life. Here's what you, as the Christian counselor or pastor, can do for a non-Christian. You know something? Christians believe that Christ is raised from the dead. Heaven has been secured. Bring that to bear on your bad B's. Really? And you meet with this person, they start to get a glimmer of it, and you go, wait a minute. Didn't you tell me one time you don't think you're a Christian? Yeah, I told you that. Would you like to think about this? You know what? It works a lot better with believers than it does with unbelievers. It really does. I used it in a PhD in these counseling courses, PhD secular textbook in psychotherapy, and here's what the guy says at the beginning. He says there are many, many psychotherapies in the world today. Almost all of them concentrate on what's called the cognitive method. Here's the cognitive method. Your brain tells your emotions, in C.S. Lewis's words, where to get off. I'd love to talk to you about Lewis. I published an article a long time ago calling Lewis an advanced emotional doubter. And Lewis brings these same things to bear on doubt and tells you how they work for him. But he said this, so I'll just give you one line of many choices in Lewis. He said, yeah, I doubt right now. Sometimes I wonder about my salvation. He said, but let me tell you something. Remember, he's 32 years old before he became a Christian. He was an atheist. Teaching at Oxford as an atheist. He said, right now, yeah, I have some questions. But I'm going to tell you something. When I was an atheist, I also had doubts. And then he said this line. If you don't know how to handle your emotions, his phrase was, if you don't know how to tell your emotions where to get off, you can't be a good Christian, good as in, you're not saved, good as in consistent. You can't be a good Christian. You can't even be a good atheist. All you can be is a creature dithering to and fro, dependent on the latest state of your digestion. I got a lot of doubts today. What'd you have for dinner? That's Lewis. And Lewis says, same page. He says, if you don't know how to handle this, you have about as much chance of getting rid of your doubt as a snowflake has of maintaining its consistency in the mouth of a blast furnace. You're not going to be consistent. So I'm mostly doing factual doubt, do the resurrection, stay with it, realize what it means, and realize what you have because of it. Paul does it repeatedly, and he's not the only one. Jesus did it. It's the only sign he gave the Pharisees. But for emotional doubt, pick out your doubts, your lies, what you say to yourself, your misbeliefs. I'm worried about this. Make a list. I'm worried about A, B, C, and D. What do you answer? We were taught to make columns. My misbeliefs, my lies, whatever you want to call them. Second column, what's the truth? And list several truths for each one that contradicts that misbelief. And the consequence is, at the very least, most likely, your anxiety will decrease. And I'm no psychologist, I'm not a psychotherapist. I don't do those things. I just got into enough hot water that they said, come tell our PhD counselors how to do this. It's not that hard. But that book again says all of counseling is a footnote to this sort of thing. So I'll leave these up here. I'll put it up there for a few minutes. Here's some things for you. Expect to doubt. Identify the variety. Be diligent. Here's the key. Practice, practice, practice. And watch your spiritual growth. That's the key. But the key, one word, is practice. Practice. And the bottom line, what Jesus did for us, now apply that. Well, I don't know, I've never got this idea of applying theology. Try it. Apply it to what you're saying to yourself. Quit lying to yourself. Or when someone in your family does it? I'm over. Let me tell you a quick story, very short. My wife, the mother of my 4 children, died of stomach cancer when she was 43. I remarried. One day, she had heard me do this lecture a lot of times. And I said the 2 most common things you could do are what ifs and does it hurt? And so she was carrying one of those plastic containers of dirty clothes, and she was going down to the laundry room. And I was calling down to her. I don't even know. The thing was so important, I didn't remember it the next day. But I was saying, like, how are we going to pay this one bill? I mean, should we do this? Should we do that? Should we do this? And by that time, she had dumped the clothes, and she came around the corner. And I was calling down, and here she came. She turned the corner. She walked up the stairs. And I said, what if? What if we do this? What about? And she walked past me, and here's all she said. She walked past me. Picture me standing here, and she goes, what if, what if, what if, what if? And she went around the corner, and I looked, and she disappeared into the bedroom. I said, boy, she whipped my tail. She's heard me say that in all these lectures, and she's going, what if? She's saying, physician, heal thyself. Do something. And it's right there in Scripture. Practice it. I can't guarantee. I don't know what goes on, but I think it can change your life. Oh, by the way, free book back at our book table. Looks like a movie book, and it is, but there's 4 apologetic essays on here. Jesus lived. He did miracles. Did he die on the cross? Did he rise from the dead? Free book on the table. Last year we did this, and we said 1 per family. Everyone take 1 if you want one. And if you already got one, take a couple, give them away. I got plenty. Back at the table. Okay, have a good evening.